Last year's Los Angeles wildfires were among the costliest and most destructive disasters in U.S. history. One of the hardest hit communities was Altadena, where the Eaton Fire ravaged entire neighborhoods. It burned about 14,000 acres, killed 19 people, and destroyed more than 9,000 structures, including 6,000 homes. Today, more than a year later, Altadena is still rebuilding, but the next threat is already here. California's 2026 wildfire season is already overactive, with nearly 41,000 acres having already burned across the state, nearly double the average for this point in the year. This, as you can imagine, is really scary for LA residents. And yet, the Trump administration appears to be making it harder for Californians to prepare for what's next. Recent reporting from the Washington Post found that the Trump administration has been withholding FEMA grant money for wildfire prevention and preparation in blue states. California specifically is still waiting on roughly $1.7 billion in FEMA money that has been stalled since last year. To date, Trump has not approved any money related to preventing wildfires in LA. Obviously, I'm not speaking to you from my normal home studio today. This week, I took the show on the road to Washington, D.C., broadcasting from the Museum of Unnatural Disasters, which is an exhibit produced by the Climate Action Campaign to highlight how climate change is making weather feel more and more unnatural. To better understand this and what the political fight actually means for communities on the ground that are battling extreme weather disasters, we're going to talk to two people who have lived through these experiences. First, I'd like to introduce Savannah Bradley, the co-founder of A Resilient Tomorrow, otherwise known as ART, a community-led disaster recovery organization founded after the Eaton Fire by Black women with deep roots in Altadena. Savannah's congresswoman is Representative Judy Chu, who we're going to hear from in a little bit. But first, let's set the scene. Savannah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I feel like we should set the context in here that it is like hot in DC today.
Extremely hot.
We're in an AC studio, and yet
Not enough.
it feels appropriate for the conversation that we're about to have, honestly. For people, listeners who don't know anything about Altadena, can you tell us a little about it? Like, what do you love the most about it?
That's a loaded question because there's so much that I love. I will start by saying that Altadena is known for its beauty. It's called beautiful Altadena for a reason. Altadena has more of a small town rural feel where you do truly know your neighbors, and it feels like everywhere you're going, you're seeing familiar faces. You can hear birds chirping, trees. We're nestled at the base of the mountains, and so there's hiking trails, very accessible to people from all parts of the community. And it is extremely diverse in the best way. It's not just diverse because of race, culture, religion. We're also talking about the jobs that people hold. We have NASA scientists and professors and artists and musicians and actors and actresses who left the crazy LA lifestyle to make a home in Altadena.
And you've lived there your whole life?
Lived there pretty much my entire life since I was 3 years old. So I grew up there.
Yeah, it sounds like you're very passionate about this community. Yeah. But obviously something very horrible happened there in January 2025. Can you take us back to that day of the Eaton Fire and like, where were you? What is your fire story?
So I was coming back from out of town, landing into LAX as I can see in the distance my community burning on fire. And so when my parents were picking me up at LAX, I begged them, I said, can I please go get my car? Which sounds ridiculous, but we were in a zone that at that point in time was relatively safe. And when I went to go get my car, I had friends from the community reaching out to me saying, can you please check on my house? Because they had already been evacuated. And so I did my best against what disaster responders and emergency responders would probably tell you to do.
That's terrifying.
But people wanted to know. They wanted that peace of mind. So I got in my car and I'm driving through the community and I'm trying to stop and take pictures of people's houses to kind of let them know if it's standing or not. And it felt scary. It was the first time I had ever felt afraid in my neighborhood, not just of the disaster, but of the stress and the human impact of people scattered, running everywhere, shouting. You know, I got out my car and I'm looking around and someone yells at me, get water, do something. And I'm like, I want to, I'm trying. I don't have any water. I just got off a flight, you know? But the most starking moment that I had was being in my car and seeing fire trucks drive past burning buildings, because you can't save every structure.
Yeah.
And so if the burnt building is already on fire, there's nothing they could do. You know, I'm not upset at the firefighters. I understand it was a capacity issue, but to see fire trucks drive past a burning building is like the most insane view that you can imagine.
Have you ever felt fear like that before? That sounds really scary to me.
Yeah, I mean, I felt fear, but nothing like that.
Yeah.
Nothing like that. And the realization of the worst is yet to come for some. For many, it was the end of their life. And for others, it was the start of a new chapter, and not in a positive way.
I feel like so often we get the story of these wildfires in numbers, you know, like even as a reporter, you're reporting on wildfires, you're looking at the numbers, how many structures, how many people died, you know, how many homes, how many acres. But you don't see that number when you're driving through. You just see your community suffering. So what did you do afterwards?
So afterwards, the next day after I got back and I evacuated to my grandmother's, the next morning, the fires had calmed, the winds had stopped. So I went to the grocery store. I bought everything that I could fit in my small Honda, and everything that I could afford. And I drove to the nearby shelter in Pasadena, the Pasadena Convention Shelter, to donate goods and volunteer my time. And I was met with, we cannot accept any more donations, which is actually a beautiful thing, that there was so much outpouring support from community members that they physically could not take any more volunteers or donations. And so that aspect was heartwarming and beautiful in a way. But then I saw something different as I was leaving. I'm leaving with an armful of toilet paper because I figured that's always something that people need. And people are asking me, where did you get that toilet paper from? Where did you get that water? And so there are people who are not staying in the shelter, but they're staying at a coworker's house, a family friend's house, staying in their car, who still had immediate needs and had absolutely nothing. And so from there, along with 3 other women that I grew up with from the community, we started doing distribution drives in front of one of our front lawns. And what started by, you know, a ragtag group getting donations together, we had other volunteers, people we knew from high school, neighbors from down the street, all come together and donate and distribute all of these items, often to people who are not getting support from the shelter, nor were they receiving immediate aid.
What made you be like, I'm just going to start doing that? Like, I'm just going to fill that gap myself versus trying to like find someone else that was doing it.
So I'll actually credit the idea of doing specifically a distribution drive to one of our other co-founders, Allison Moore. We had reached out to her like, hey, we're collecting donations. And she was like, I'm going to do a distribution drive in front of my house. So we collected all the donations we had. We met with her at her house. But it was a little outside the way. And so one thing led to another. And it was really just that need of like, we need to meet somewhere central that has not burnt. So we're in a very, very centralized area where more people could access needs if they weren't hearing about it from somewhere else.
And now it's an organization that does, as I understand it, not just, you know, recovery, but also trying to do, you know, resilience efforts as well. So how did it grow?
So it was one step at a time. It kind of snowballed, but people need policy and advocacy. People need advocacy work to inform policy. We want preventative measures. We want this to not happen again. We want people to actually, for it to be affordable for them to build back their homes. We want home hardening efforts. Like, there were a lot of community needs that we saw, and the gap wasn't just immediate aid. It was long-term aid. It was financial support. It was policy change that was helpful for them, whether it was mortgage forbearance, or whatever it might be. And so it was just one step at a time. We just kept growing.
So what are some of like the specific gaps that you saw that your organization then identified, like this is advocacy, specific advocacy that we want to do?
I will say that there were gaps that we saw ourselves that we found to be important, especially in the climate space. When you are faced with a disaster and people have lost everything, they're not wanting to talk about how to build back electric. You're asking to put another thing on their plate. And so when we had climate organizations coming to us and being like, hey, we want to do this campaign, we want people to build back electric, X, Y, and Z, but with no knowledge of what people were actually going through and where their mindsets were at. People were still in survival mode. We wanted to lift that effort for residents who wanted their homes hardened, but also needed it to be financially affordable. And then on top of that, we also had a listening session with residents where they spoke about their immediate needs.
What specifically were they telling you that they needed?
Money.
Money.
Money. And that's what everybody needed. That's what everybody does need. Money, mental health resources and support, even childcare, anything to make it easier for people to rebuild and make it financially accessible. A lot of people were underinsured. People were truly, truly underinsured. People need more bridge gap funding. So that is an aspect of money that people need. Insurance on average falls short $200,000 to $350,000 under what is needed to rebuild.
Like per person?
Per person, per household, per family.
I mean, that also brings up the question of like rebuild versus retreat. The fact that insurance won't cover home insurance there, that like the community should not be rebuilt. How do you, when you hear that, how do you feel about that?
Easier to say, harder done. I think it's important to be realistic about where people are in their lives. These are people of all ages. We have 85, 90-year-olds who plan to live and die in that home up until their last breath. You're asking people in their 80s to move out of state.
Find a new community.
To find a whole new community in the last years of their life. It's just not feasible. You're asking children to leave their friends when they've already lost so much. And ultimately, let's be realistic, climate change is getting worse. This is going to happen again. And it's not just going to happen in Altadena. It's going to happen to communities across the nation and across the world.
Yeah.
And we can't just keep running. That's not a solution, to just keep running away. We need climate resiliency on a global scale. That is the answer. Climate change, we are really at the point of no return. So it is a question of how do we, prevent climate change and reduce the impacts, but how do we strengthen our communities? That is, at this point, the real solution going forward, not running away.
So obviously in the top of the show, I mentioned that there are FEMA grants that are being delayed throughout California. Did FEMA have a visible presence in your community at all?
Yes and no. FEMA had a presence from the perspective of disaster case managers. They set up an office space where residents could come and meet with, FEMA and talk about their needs and apply for funding and aid. But that process through FEMA is not a quick process. And they weren't providing immediate disaster aid. You didn't see FEMA handing out food and clothing. You saw World Central Kitchen. You didn't necessarily see FEMA. That was really community-based organizations that were doing that immediate response and immediate needs. And although I respect FEMA workers and I appreciate the work that they're doing, I just would say that they really limited capacity, especially because these disaster case managers would not always collaborate with community-based organizations. They would tell us what they're doing, but they wouldn't allow us to be involved in the work that we were already doing. And so it really created a separation between FEMA and what the support the community was actually receiving.
There has been reports that, like we mentioned at the top of the show, that the Trump administration has withheld funding from California, and specifically funding that could support rebuilding and preparation for the next wildfire. So have you seen the effects of that?
I've seen the effects just due to the lack of support. That's really what it is. And I mean, we haven't gone through a disaster on this scale before. I can only tell you what we're lacking, and that is lacking funding for home hardening and rebuilding efforts, a lack of funding for families. Most families did not receive, I would say the average was about $110 a person in disaster aid for family. $110 is nothing.
And they still grocery run.
Yeah, it can barely get you through the week. All you is we have not seen grants and we have not seen subsidies in order for us to do the home hardening efforts that we need.
If you could have it your way and the federal government were providing more assistance, like What do you see as the biggest gaps that could be filled there?
It's rebuilding, it's preparing, it's also health impacts. So FEMA, when funding was provided, most of that funding went to the little bit of cash aid for thousands of families. We have to understand that this wasn't just a wildfire that stuck in the mountains. This was an urban wildfire in which
it burns stuff that's not good to burn.
Yes, everything is now covered by this toxic ash. And so soil remediation is incredibly expensive, and it passes on to the homeowner. And so if people cannot afford to do soil remediation, it has extreme health impacts. Also rising cost of housing, because now we have less housing than we did before. It's not as affordable. And then of course, when we talk about resilience, if we don't have grants to make it affordable to build back the community stronger, when this happens again, we are vulnerable. We're still vulnerable, and we are even more vulnerable now than we were before. And so it impacts on every level.
Well, and one of the elephants in the room that we haven't talked about yet is that this is a historically Black community. This is a place where, redlining pushed Black families into this area, and that area is the area that primarily burned. And it's my understanding that 18 of the 19 people who died lived in West Altadena. How does that factor into the work that you do?
That is a loaded question because there's multiple parts of it.
Yeah.
I'm first going to address from a climate standpoint and what that really means. When we look at climate change and we look at the areas where disasters are happening, are most likely to happen, are the most frequent, where people of color, especially Black and brown people, were first originally able to buy homes, it is typically in areas that have higher risk. And so when we're talking about where these fires happen, it's also about who is most impacted, who it primarily happens to. Yes, climate change impacts us all, but it primarily impacts those who are in danger zones. And when we think about why all those deaths happen, despite the fact that the fire occurred on both west and east side of Altadena, it is because the west side of Altadena did not receive evacuation orders. Many people did not receive evacuation orders at all. And so when we even talk about response systems, are they equitable? People, not only the people of color, because it was a historically Black neighborhood, not only the people of color that passed away, we're also talking about elderly and people with disabilities. If you do not give them enough evacuation orders, they're not able to evacuate in a time that allows them to live. And one final point that I would like to make on that, because Altadena is a historically Black community, we had Black home ownership rates of twice the national average. This was an area where people could own homes that were passed for generations. So people went from being homeowners in a relatively comfortable situation to losing everything overnight. We lost Black generational wealth, Black home ownership that was important to the community, especially for one that has been disenfranchised for so long.
I can't imagine how difficult it is. And then also, as we sort of touched on a little bit earlier, wildfire season has started once again. Yes. And climate change has contributed to, super drying out California. There's basically no snowpack. And so the season is looking to be overactive, which is very scary. So what does that feel like on the ground to be literally recovering from one climate fueled disaster while the next wildfire season has arrived?
Terrifying. It feels scary. I think people have really lost their sense of security, their sense of safety. And so it's a traumatic experience. So when we approach this wildfire season or whenever there's high winds, it feels scary. Generally, the last time we had extremely high winds, I felt fear in a way that I had never felt before. And so when we are approaching the season, people are doing their best to prepare. We're doing community lot cleanups, where people are going around and removing debris and overgrown, dried vegetation from community lots. And we're doing what we can to prepare, but ultimately it feels terrifying.
Did you ever expect that you would be a victim of climate change in this way or thrust into this advocacy work?
No, never. I did not think that most of my community would end up as climate refugees. I was never expecting that. But it really does make me think about it a different way. Of even if your community isn't the one that is immediately impacted, you will feel the effects, whether it's financial or health. Ultimately, you will. It is coming for everyone. And you might not even realize the way in which it's impacting you. For a lot of the communities surrounding Altadena, think about how far that smoke blew with the winds. Think about how dust, it doesn't just settle in one area. It is in our rivers, in our streams. It's in the food that we eat that's dispersed, it's in everything. And so it truly is coming for us all. And I never, ever would have thought it would have been us.
Later, we're going to talk to your representative, Judy Chu, who has introduced a bill in Congress to essentially make polluters pay for some disaster recovery costs. I'm wondering, when you're engaging on these on the ground efforts in your community, how often are you guys talking about the concept of whether polluters should be paying for this? Is this something that feels connected to people's lives, or is it like far away from the immediate work of getting home?
People do want someone to pay. People want someone to pay in terms of resilience and remediation and how do we address this going forth. But the concept of making polluters pay, I think, is a little abstract for the everyday person. We're mostly asking typically our government to pay. How can they help protect us in our community? And so when we talk about making polluters pay, it's not a common discussion, but it is brought up in certain specific circles of people who are already keyed into that concept and idea. For those who are not, it's a lift in an abstract concept that does not take first priority compared to others.
Well, I want to end on this note. When you are imagining Altadena, not just rebuilt, but rebuilt justly, what does that look like to you? How do you envision Altadena in the future?
I'll start on a not so positive note to end on a positive one. As of right now, a majority of the lots or damaged homes that have been sold to investors or corporations.
Oh.
And so I worry about the future of my community. If and when people rebuild, who is going to be allowed to come back? Who will be able to return to their homes? What will my community look like? For those of us who moved there, we moved there for the diversity, for the beauty, for the accessibility. And I don't know if that will still be there. And so when I think of a future for Altadena, in an ideal world, we have homes, single family homes. We have affordable housing units. I just want community members from all walks of life to move back in, and I want people from the area to have the first opportunity to buy them.
I think that's a nice note to end on. Savannah Bradley, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And now I'm going to head up to the Hill, talk to Judy Chu. I'm sure she's going to love it.
Congresswoman Judy Chu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So you represent a district that's at the heart of what's been called one of the most expensive natural disasters in U.S. history. Do you have a sense today of the total economic damage to your district alone?
This was billions of dollars worth of damage that was done. And I can just tell you that we can say that FEMA came up with about $3 billion worth of compensation to people so that they could get that temporary housing and temporary money to live on. But that also, we are asking for $16 billion more in disaster supplemental funding. And half of that would go to the Palisades and half of it would go to our area of the Eaton Fire. This is just for the fundamental restoration of living, because you see, 6,000 homes burned down. 3,000 of those homes have now started the process or are well within the process of rebuilding. But what that means is that 3,000 have not started the process at all.
So is that one of the main ways that you as a member of Congress are trying to help the people of your district by asking for federal aid from FEMA?
Yes. Well, actually, this is the disaster supplemental funds. The funds from FEMA serve a different purpose. They serve the purpose of providing the temporary living conditions for those who are struck by an emergency. And in fact, a deadline is coming up in July. The living expense element of FEMA is to expire. So we have asked for an extension of the living expense portion of FEMA. And so I talked to the FEMA administrator, Bob Fenton, and he was confident that they would extend it because they know far too well that the construction has not yet been completed for the vast majority of the residents of that area.
Yeah, I read that out of 5,600 properties that suffered significant damage, only 23 had been rebuilt as of this December. That's a community that's obviously still struggling over a year later.
Definitely still struggling. I do have to say, though, that when you drive around Altadena, you do see construction going on. So it is encouraging to see these homes going up, but there's nowhere near completion. So I'm not surprised at that number of 23.
So we talked about a little bit about your efforts to ask for federal aid from FEMA. And shortly before Trump's inauguration, he had very famously threatened to withhold disaster funding from California as this form of political punishment. At the time, you had said that, you were concerned about those threats, but hopeful that Trump would ultimately be supportive of disaster recovery in California. So I guess my question to you is, has he been?
Well, it's a very mixed answer. He was at first saying that he would withhold funding from FEMA to California based on wanting to have changes in our voting system. So there are all these arbitrary reasons as to why he was going to withhold the funding. Now, I do have to say, thank goodness, the FEMA funding was already in the budget. So the FEMA administrator was able to dispense the funds for living, for food, for everyday expenses. There were 58,000 loans from the Small Business Disaster Loan Program, which is part of this. And they're not just for small businesses, they're also for homes. But what we are looking for is this disaster supplemental fund, which would, I think, go a long way towards helping that other 3,000 I was talking about that still are trying to build their homes.
Recent reporting from the Washington Post found that FEMA has been withholding grant money for wildfire prevention and preparation in blue states specifically. And California is still waiting on roughly $1.7 billion in FEMA money that has been stalled since last year, again, for preparation.
Mm-hmm.
Is any of that delayed money supposed to go to your district, or have you seen any impacts from that delay?
We are actually asking for an accounting of that to see how many of these projects are in our area. But it's of tremendous concern. This is nearly $2 billion worth of funds that could go towards making us safer from these kinds of hazards. In fact, that's what they are called, hazard mitigation grants. And the communities come to rely on them to make their cities more resilient. And yes, we've only gotten 1% of the funds that we should have gotten by this time for this year. So it is of concern because it seems like the blue states are being punished.
Well, the Trump administration has sort of responded to this whole situation, implying that it's not always the federal government's job to be funding recovery projects, resilience projects. In a statement to the Washington Post, the White House spokesperson said, "There's no politicization to the president's decisions on disaster relief. The president is just ensuring that American tax dollars are used appropriately and efficiently by the states to supplement, not substitute, their obligation to respond and recover from disasters." So how do you respond to that? Does Altadena really need federal recovery money?
It is foolish to withhold these funds, which would actually prevent disasters from being as severe as they have been. We need it more than ever. This would actually save this country money if we were able to have this kind of restructuring. So it is completely upside down to say that this kind of funding is not needed.
So going back to these delayed FEMA grants, you said that you're asking the administration for more details on that. Can you elaborate on that? What are you doing to figure out whether your district is impacted by this withheld funding?
Yeah, we've issued a letter to the department in charge to get that exact accounting.
But as of this stage, is it just like you're not sure exactly which grants have been withheld?
Yeah, we don't
Right.
know actually at this point. So we just know that there have been complaints from the various jurisdictions that they haven't received this funding and they need it immediately.
Right. We're talking about the federal government's responsibility to pay. You reintroduced the Polluters Pay Climate Fund Act,
Yes.
Arguing that the fossil fuel companies that help drive the climate crisis should also be some of the parties that pay. And this bill, as I understand it, would require some of the largest fossil fuel companies to pay into a fund that would go towards climate damages and resilience. Can you explain just a little bit what that bill is and what it would do?
We would finally have some fund that would be there to mitigate the damage that they cause. So yes, this would go into a fund, and that fund would be in existence for immediate reimbursement to those areas that are experiencing this kind of crisis. So it's only fair that there be that kind of mitigation available immediately. And if they were paying into such a fund, then it would be available immediately.
This might seem like an obvious question, but what are the political obstacles to passing something like that? It sort of seems like a fever dream. It makes logical sense, at least to discuss, but it just seems like it would be almost impossible to get through.
There is a huge oil lobby in Washington, D.C. And of course, we have tried to combat them with our Inflation Reduction Act, which would have reduced climate change by 40% by reducing the carbon emissions by 40%. And I was very proud of this. I thought we were going to make tremendous progress in getting towards renewables. But immediately as Trump took office, he started dismantling the Inflation Reduction Act and actually increasing ways that the fossil fuels could then have dominance over energy in this country.
Well, I know we're coming up on the end of our time. So my final question for you, is there a way for Congress to come together on some of these issues while President Trump is in office? Or are communities like Altadena just basically screwed until Trump leaves because he won't give assistance to blue communities or because he's so bought off by big oil? Is there any way forward?
Well, actually, there is bipartisan work towards trying to deal with these disasters because every area has had a disaster. So we had the tornadoes in North Carolina, and of course there were the terrible floods in Texas. So we have three major disasters where areas were completely devastated. And what we always say is that this disaster supplemental funding should come forth with no strings attached because disasters don't have a political party. They are not red. They are not blue. They are disasters. And we owe it to every American to be able to make sure that they can recover during the most devastating time of their lives.
Well, Representative Judy Chu, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you.